Welcome to the Stoa, the elusive I, the nature and function of the self. Our good friends John Vervaeke is here today with Gregg Henriques and my favorite Zoom drinking buddy, Christopher Mastropietro. Chris, Gregg and John, they were having a series, Dialogos, called the Elusive I, and it concluded. And this is an opportunity for people to ask questions about what came alive for them in an interactive way here at the Stoa. And so how today's going to work, John, Gregg, and Chris are going to engage in a brief dialogos for maybe 10, 20 minutes, just maybe summarizing this, the series, anything that came up for them. And during this portion, if everyone can like turn their cameras off, just so the three of them will show up on the YouTube channel, and then we'll ask you to come back on after they speak. So anytime, even right now, since if you watch the series or whatever, just start throwing your question in the chat. I will, when it's the Q&A portion, I'll call on you and you can unmute yourself and you can ask your question to the Dialogos trio today. So that being said, I will take in John. Welcome back, my friend.
Thanks, Peter. It's great to be here. Of course, it's great to be here with Gregg and Chris. And thank you for this opportunity. We got requests from people who had been watching the series, we could do a live Q&A, and Gregg came up with the excellent idea. Why don't we approach Peter and see if we can do this via the Stoa, which of course is the perfect home for this. So, we're not going to try and summarize, each one of the episodes was about an hour and a half. So we're not going to try and summarize like 18 hours of work that we did. What we did want to do is give people sort of an overview of what we went in with, what we thought we were doing, and what we came away with. Each one of us is maybe talk about for 5 minutes or so, and then we'll move on. So I'll go first.
Great.
And so what I went in with is I wanted to try and present an argument, a progressive argument about the nature of the self. This is something that is much invoked both within psychology and within our popular culture. It's invoked a lot without it being explicated or discussed very much in a sort of comprehensive and coherent fashion. So I knew that there was a tremendous amount of work being done in cognitive science, philosophy, psychology, and neuroscience around this. I've been teaching courses on it. And so I thought what I would do was try to bring that argument into a dialogical format, because I was, as much as the material of the series about the nature and function of the self, I was also very much interested in the manner of the presentation. Gregg and I have already worked on this a bit with Untangling the World Knot, our series on consciousness. And then Chris and I have done a lot of work already. And so we brought it into this idea of, can we integrate a progressive argumentation that has sort of a chorus of dialogos running around it and permeating it and transforming it, something much more like the original Platonic dialogues around Socrates. Not that I was Socrates or anything ridiculous like that. But so we were trying to get something that bridges between what you might call academic rigor and existential transformation. Those that people, who are not interested in a purely academic sense, but who should be, I would argue, interested in knowing thyself, as Socrates famously said, and what that means and what the ramifications are. I mean, if at the center of your life, and I'm not saying we're selfish or anything like that, but at the center of your life is this idea of yourself as a self, the degree to which that is obscure or vague or perhaps incoherent is the degree to which it's going to reflect back into your life and the way your life impacted on others. So I thought what we could do is we could bring in a discussion. We could show why the common sense everyday notion that people have around the self has been terrifically challenged by science, philosophy and science, cognitive science broadly. And does that mean, therefore, as some people are now want to say, there is no self? Is the self is just an illusion? These are popular books. There was a book by Hood called The Self-Illusion, and we talked about it in the series. So taking up this question about what's the nature of the self, and can we understand it in terms of um, uh, the kinds of processes that cognitive science are talking about. Some of you might be familiar with the work that I've done in my series and also the work I'm doing with Gregg. Can we use the more cutting edge ideas from dynamical systems, complex systems theory, relevance realization theory, etc., to try and build a more comprehensive and viable model of the self that can, and I ultimately argued that there's a sense in which we can still, with complete rational justification, assert that the self is a real thing, even though the self is not sort of anything like a homogeneous blob of immaterial stuff or something like that. So I went into it doing that, and of course, with my expectations that I would have, one of the great systematic thinkers that I've become aware of, Gregg, on one hand, and a person whose soul sings to the heart of the universe, Chris, on the other, and trying to to weave those together with cognitive scientific theoretical argument. And I was, of course, even though my expectations were high, they were more than exceeded by these two gentlemen. I learned a lot from Gregg. Every time Gregg and I integrate our systems, there's a synergy and something happens and something springs forth. And then what I was expecting, but again, he transcended my expectations, was Chris was going to bring in a spiritual existential dimension, especially from his deep reflections on Kierkegaard and Kierkegaard's reflections on the nature of self. And Chris just hit the ball out of the ballpark on that. And so you get, I hope, this is how it seems to me, I'm incredibly biased, but you get this cognitive scientific argument woven in with Gregg's metapsychology and clinical theorizing and expertise, and then Chris's existential spiritual development on that, and then the interpenetration of all those went beyond anything that I could ever have achieved on my own. So I came out of it deeply enriched, and like when I go back to teach this course again, I'm going to teach it differently. I mean, within the academic setting, precisely because of this series. So that's everything I'm going to say, and then I'm going to turn my mic off for a sec and let Gregg come in now.
Beautiful, John. Thank you so much. This really, it's been transformative for myself. A couple of things. I'll pick up where you left off. The intersection between the cognitive science model, the theoretical clinical psychology into psychotherapy frame that I have, and Chris's existential brilliance and angle and deepening was genuinely moving. And I think that we effectively did walk through a problematizing of the self, generating through your expertise, generated a coherent model of how the self evolves from a phylogenetic perspective, how it operates through recursive relevance realization, especially through modeling the self and the agent arena relation in a particular way. That jumped out at me. And then to build off of that, I had many clinical insights over the course of our exchange and sense as a function of that. And then to situate that and to listen to Chris's articulation of extracting some core Kierkegaardian thinking, I was seeing the challenge of the self in relationship to what it means clinically to try to coherently integrate oneself and to be grounded in the body and to be coherently pieced together at the level of heart and mind and spirit, or else in the challenge of despair. And it really was quite dramatic. So I was great. It was thrilling. I'll say specifically for me, as probably is well known now, I repeat it fairly regularly. I stumbled into this thing called justification systems theory, this idea that, hey, for humans, language creates this problem of propositional speech, creates this problem of justification. And that afforded me a particular way to aspectualize human consciousness. You hear now John's terms are now seeping through my vocabulary, but to aspectualize the core consciousness of the primate, the internal narrator and ego, and the justifying public self on the culture person stage. And I just qualified this experiential self. That's what I called it, relative to the private narrating ego. But what has happened to me over these course of really the 2 series, John, is the delineation of experiential consciousness from an unbelievably integrated, sophisticated model of cognition, recursive relevance realization, and then into a self that extends itself on the one hand in the environment, and then through the relational field. I developed the influence matrix. So you have this recursive relational system, which we then intersect with Tomasello to create this primate field, this hominid preverbal primate field. And the idea that when people come to me clinically, the experience of their relating to that part of their heart, the injuries and attachment, the failures and pride and shame, the nature of guilt, the split between anger and guilt and shame and hate, and the confusion in that experiential self and how to narrate it and how to justify it. Well, through your model, I can see that with a degree of clarity and resolution that I certainly didn't have prior to series. And it's been great. It's really elucidated a lot of fine-grained detail that I only had fuzzy access to prior. And I feel very grateful for that.
All right. And so for my part, I would be lying if I didn't say that I had some trepidation about doing this in the first instance, doing this series. John posed this to me back in 2020, and at the time I was quite excited about the prospect. I mean, I trust John implicitly and would do pretty much anything with him, as he knows. And I was quite excited about the prospect of doing it with Gregg, because Gregg is someone who at the time I didn't know very well. And so the prospect of being the third wheel to these 2 incredibly impressive systematic thinkers was as exciting as it was quite humbling. And so I realized that I would have to decide what kind of ethos to bring to the enterprise, because my function would have to be different from theirs. I am not the systematic theorist that either of them are. And so determined that the best way to engage was to kind of bear witness, in some sense, to bear existential witness to the imminent implications of those discussions as they emerged in real time, and to try and track them and chronicle them as best as possible. And, I came into this series very much with a Jungian, and have left with one, frankly, but that doesn't mean that the series hasn't been impressive in the proper sense of the term. It has been deeply impressive, but sometimes being impressive is to enrich and deepen that which you already bring to something. And so I very much came with a Jungian idea that of the self as the whole of the person, right? That ineffable totality that he speaks and writes of very extensively. And I felt it was quite a precarious exercise to try and image and schematize that totality, to envelop it, for fear of wanting to consume it. Now, I trust these 2 gentlemen implicitly, so I knew that that would not be the intent. The intent would be to contrast the unattainable ambition of such a thing against the Socratic enjoinder to know thyself, and that there would be a tension that would persist between those 2 things. And I think it did persist. And as every session went along, I tried to keep that tension in mind, the knowledge that whatever we were doing was in service of something that couldn't possibly be compassed by the scope of our discussions, no matter how rich they became, and yet that there was some valor in the attempt. And then the question is, well, why is there valor in the attempt? And it's actually, I don't think, as obvious as it seems. Because I think all kinds of people have undertaken theories of selfhood. But I think the thing that distinguishes those projects is not necessarily the intellectual integrity of their conclusions. I think it has much more to do with the intentionality of the undertaking. So to me, I think the practice of trying to image that which can't be imagined sufficiently has something to do with the final cause of its practice. What will is it actually trying to arouse? What decisions is it trying to conduce, right? What pose does the soul make when it poses the questions it poses? And in posing the question, was it oriented to the right things, right? And one way of thinking about that, I think, is to think of it as the difference between, the modeling, the extensive modeling that John and Gregg both presented could be seen as ways of reconstructing the experience of selfhood in metaphor, right? This is that, right? This model is somehow the self. But of course, we know, ironically, we know that it's not the self, right? We know that whatever models are being advanced can't reduce the complexity of such a thing. So then what are they for? And I think that they're much more, rather than being metaphoric in that sense, they're much more metonymic, which is to say they are extracts of the complex itself that participate in it if they're oriented correctly, right? Not this equals that, but this in service of that. And so I think the question for me became, the question upon which the integrity of the project rested was, does this exercise participate and ultimately advance the project of being oneself better, becoming oneself better? Because for me, if it doesn't do that, frankly, then regardless of its intellectual bona fides, the enterprise is bankrupt. Now, clearly, I don't believe that's the case. I do believe, and began every session believing and ended every session believing, that the orientation of the exercise was a gesture in the right direction. But I think that's sort of the way I think of it, that the dialogue is a way of orienting to its object. And if the dialogic process that we've just completed can't successfully participate in that very thing that it ostends to be or explain, then ultimately it's all for naught. So the faith I invested into it was certainly rewarded, and of course it was, because John and Gregg are, it doesn't get any better than that. So that's where I'll leave it.
All right. Thank you, man. That's beautiful.
Thanks, Chris. That, as always, was very beautiful. So I'm going to tag Peter back in here now, and he's going to come in and maybe he has a couple of general questions he might want to ask. And after that, this is why we're here. We're here for Q&A. So
cool. Yeah, so everyone can feel free to turn on their camera, let there be light in the Stoa. I'm too awestruck by Chris's words right now to have a coherent question. So, but there's some in the chat, and I imagine I'll have some later on. And we're here for 90 minutes in total, just to presence that. So the first question is Warren. Warren, if you can unmute yourself.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks for having me along. So this is addressed to all three of you, but John, I know that you're Jungian part of the week, not necessarily all of the week. So I don't know if this is a Jungian day for you or not. But I have a Jungian question. So where do you all think the Jungian construct of egocentric versus heliocentric now sits in this wider paradigm of engaging with the self and understanding the self better? Thank you.
well, I hope Chris will answer too, because Chris has imbibed very deeply from the Jungian well. I read Anthony Storr's book a long time ago on Jung, and he made the argument that that Jung is going to survive in a way Freud isn't, because Freud was bound to a Newtonian hydraulic model of the psyche that is going to be progressively made moribund. And Ricoeur made a similar kind of argument about Freud. And whereas he said the thing about Jung is Jung's organic model is going to be very open to dynamical systems theory and complex systems. And I think that prediction is coming true. I think the evidence that it's coming true is quite accurate. So I think one of the things that came out of the series was the fact that we often found ourselves and and Chris and Gregg also have considerable experience in Jung. We often found ourselves moving between I don't know what adjective to use, the sort of technical cog-sci language machinery and more Jungian language as we tried to bridge between, as Chris said, we wanted to always be able to bridge between from the conceptual via the imaginal into the existential. And so that kept happening for us. Now, one of the things that, so that first of all, that's a presupposition in your question I'm addressing, which is the Jungian material still going to bear relevance? So I've made the point that I think it is, and I've explained why I think it's still going to bear relevance. And then I think the movement that you're pointing to in Jung's work, I don't know if I'd make an identity claim, but I think it is convergent with a move that I made towards the end of my argumentative presentation, which is to try and explain how people shift we got very much into the locus of the self and how they shift and they become ontocentric, and then trying to explain what that shift from an egocentric to an ontocentric orientation would mean, and what that means about how the machinery of the self was being exacted in a particular way. So I know that doesn't map exactly onto the shift from the egocentric to the heliocentric, but I think that kind of transformation that Jung was talking about using imaginal language can be, I'll be bold here, I think it can be mapped quite well onto the theoretical machinery that we proposed in the series. So I tried to answer your presupposition and the more specific thing, but I want to hear what Gregg and Chris have to say on this as well.
You want to go ahead, Gregg?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, what more is there to say about that? I mean, I think one of the things I think that's just vitally important to Jung's understanding of the self is precisely that the non-identity between the self and the ego, right? And the axis that forms that connects them into continuity, but not into equivalence. And I think to the degree that Jung cultivated, and I think he did pretty extensively, dialogic practices for facing himself, right? The vis-a-vis of Jung's practice, the active imagination, the way that he did it therapeutically, but also the way that he did it, shall we say, imaginally within the boundaries of his own interior life, I think had a lot to do with, so Jung has this term, I think he uses it in reference to God, but it could just as easily be used in reference to the self because there's a continuity of identity between those two notions. And that is wherever I am, God is wherever I am not, right? The self is wherever I am not. And the ego is how we resolve the presence of the self in the context of its encounters with the world as reflected by the various arenas in which we find ourselves embedded and embodied. And I think one of the most valuable things that Jung, even at the lowest level of resolution, even from a bird's eye view, one of the most helpful things that Jung can give us is the non-identity between myself in its egoic accoutrements and myself with a capital S, that is, again, this sort of sum of possibility that corresponds to the infinite aspect of a person, that which is always beyond myself, beyond the reach of myself at any given moment of time. And so the shift to allocentrism in practice, I think, is simply a way to dislocate the ego's presumption of its own of its position as the center of its own identity, right? So anyway, I think that's all I have at the moment for that. But yeah, I think it's a distinction that persists and that's important, and that pretty much attends to the machinery that John and Gregg both presented, even if some of the details, and the details aren't unimportant, but in broad strokes, I think there's a fair bit of consonance.
Yeah, I mean, I am not as well versed in the richness of Jung's work. I encountered him in a number of different places and really struggled to understand exactly what the hell he was talking about for a while. I'll confess that. I am circling back into Jung, and I believe that this experience, the sort of the continuity experience with John, speaks to that. Here's what I'll say in relationship to the shift of the self, which I'm actually seeing now across with greater clarity across a wider array of philosophical positions, which of course Jung would appreciate given the breadth of his interest in inquiry and relation. But I'll simply say this, is that the framing of the experiential self in relationship to the ego, in at least the way then that I would grab a hold of the structure and function of those, affords us a way to think about the ego as this justifying mind, okay? And we were then cultivated into a particular system of justification. And I really think that the pre-modern traditional into modern systems of justification really position you to then navigate the world through that system of justification. Initially through culture, nation, identity, and then maybe more through transcendent reasoning. And I think if you look at like Ian McGilchrist's work and other kinds of notions that are beginning to merge in relationship to what a meta-modern sensibility would be, we want to get adjacent to our systems of justification and the egoic investment that we have in relation and be able to connect both beneath that to the experiential self and above it to a transcendent position. And if we hold that position in relation and we are able to cultivate that, that would be a shift in relationship to self-reference that I think Jung would very much appreciate.
Any, okay, got a thumbs up from Warren. Susan, I will take you in.
So I was just fascinated. By the way, can you hear me?
Yes.
All right, I'll start my video here. So I was just fascinated with when you talked about the difference between, when John Vervaeke talked about the difference between I and me. And could you go over that again? That was just like, to me, that was just a revelation.
Happy to do so. The idea has been discovered multiple times. The person who the two people I've read most deeply on this are William James, who used specifically those two pronouns, I and me, but also Arthur Dykman has the observing self and the observed self in the book called The Observing Self. While they deserve credit for their foregrounding of this and explication, explanation, you can see this discovery happening across many contexts historically and culturally. So the basic idea is that the me reflects all those aspects of oneself. And we have to be careful not to confuse the recursive sense of self with the entity sense of self. And if that's confusing to people, ask me about that in a minute or two and we can go into it. But the point is, right, that everything that I can bring into observation such that I can make it an object of thought, an image of my sensibility, something that I can store in memory, that's the me. That is the observed self. That's the self that has been observed and is therefore can be subject to all of the sort of normal categories we have for things. You know, we can talk about it's well, look at me, look at there. For example, I can point to an image of my body. I am 5'10", right? And I can make all these kinds of attributions. And I have many. Sorry, I didn't want to do an Austin Powers thing here. I have many, not many. I have many me's. Because of course. I observe myself in different sort of reliable contexts. So I have many roles, many identities, but all the roles and identities that we can point to, those are the me. Those are the me's. The I is that which is always, so if we use the elusive I and we were punning on it, because I'll now use my I, right? So I like one thing I can't see, I can see an image of my eye, but I can't actually see my eye as a seeing organ because it is that through which I am seeing. So Whenever I'm looking at myself, there's the me, but this is what I'm looking from, is the I. And the I is not in the me, because the I is where the observing is coming from. And you say, but I can step back and look at that. Of course you can. And then that's now a me, and behind it is an I that is not within the framing of the me. And you can never step back and catch the I. You cannot jump back over that shadow, to throw in a little bit of a Jungian edge into it. And so the point about the I is, there's a couple of really interesting points. One is it's no thing, not nothing, but it's no thing. It is not that which you can bring into any kind of categorization, because you can't objectify it. It is the pure center of your subjectivity. It is never turned into an object for you. And then the interesting thing about the I, and this is something we talked about, is the way it moves around in imaginal space. Like we say things like, where are you coming from? Well, you're ultimately coming from your I. It's the point in the point of view, but that I can come from your head. It can come from your heart. It can come from your body. Like right now, where are you coming from? How are you projecting a perspective? And so the I is the pivot point of your perspectival knowing, but the I moves around. And as it moves around, it grabs different me's, and it sees and interacts with the world through different me's. And see how I'm having to rely on gesture, because language is inadequate for what I'm trying to get at here. So one of the things you'll see emphasized in what you can call meditative traditions, or meditative contemplative traditions, like the work of Nishida and Nishitani and the Kyoto school, is exactly this point about the no-thingness of the I and its irreducibility. And then one of the things that brings up is the existential question is, how do we bear responsibility? We have lots of teaching about how we bear responsibility to our me, be true to yourself and all that sort of stuff. And our culture loves all that. But there's a different question here, which is, how do we bear responsibility to the I? And how is that not, because it has to be, how is it radically distinct and different from a narcissistic self-interest in all of the wonderful me's that I am? And so that's the existential question that comes out. Did that help, Susan? Was that good?
I think I could listen to that for hours. Thank you very much. I just feel like that's a revelation.
I think I would, I'll add one layer on that, because at least for me, and I think we're in agreement in relationship to that, a lot of that can be spoken at the primate level. Okay. In other words, although the capacity for self-reflective awareness for primates, is limited, and probably our hominid ancestors. So as you hear, I like go phylogenetically. Okay. Meaning I like to go back in sort of evolution, and I like to build the stack. So one of the things that I would just say on top of that is that, and this certainly popped for me in the conversation, is that you have the adverbial kind of perspective seen through the I to see both the world and me and model me in relation. So you have that. And then what I would say to that in addition is that you have this ongoing narrator as a human tracking oneself in the culture person plane of existence. Okay, seeing what is it justified. We didn't touch too much on this, as Dan McAdams, as a social personality psychologist, talks about the modeling of the self. Okay, and so he argues that for the first, say, 2 to 6 years, you have a social actor self. That social actor self is learning the rules of the game at the level of, hey, playing a role, know what you do with your friends, know what mom says is okay, and know what's justified in that context. But then starting at maybe 7, and certainly by the time you're 13, you then evolve into an agent. And that agent can then start to reflect on the I-me relation and start to say, hey, I can choose what I desire. I can wonder. And anybody that's had adolescence as children, they wake up and say, hey, why do you, mom and dad, get to decide all the rules? Why don't I decide the rules? Okay. And so that agency, in fact, Carl Jung's got a famous point where he has this transformational phase shift. where he reflects and all of a sudden he kind of comes through the cloud of awareness and says, I am me. Okay. Well, that I me relation is actually also at a self-reflective propositional level, I would argue is another shift in relationship to this. So you have I me at a perspectival level, but then there's I me at a narrative level. And that I me at the narrative level layers on top of that. And from a unified theory perspective in particular, that's very important, because one of the things about language is it goes right through the skin, okay? Meaning that other people ask you questions and they have direct access to your narrative, I me, if they can. Hey, why do you think the way you do? And then it evolves from this social actor, ideally into an agent. And then, according to McAdams, then you, at the young adult age, you start to cultivate the narrative arc of your life and become an autobiographer. That narrative self becomes an autobiographer. And if you can align your life with the protagonist of that, then that I-me relation across time basically fulfills the protagonist themes, and you develop a generative self, model of a self. If you fail to do that, you'll encounter despair and all sorts of difficulties in relation. So that I-me relation is very nicely captured by John's frame around the experiential self. I think it gets layered and then gets entangled a lot when we start narrating it to ourselves and to others.
I'm going to add one more thing on top of that. Boy, that was Greg. That was great. I'm going to add one more thing on that, which is that one of the ways in which I think one thing that distinguishes different orders of, shall we say, self-knowledge, especially in relation to in the dialogic context, right? When you're in terms of your the capacity of other people to know you, is that oftentimes your me is something that has to be negotiated in a very embedded way. It's negotiated socially, and you can think of it as being the object that is equidistant between the eye that beholds the world and the eyes opposite you that are beholding back. And one of the things that happens when you acquaint on a more intimate level with another individual is that the I-me relation transmutes into something much more like I, you, right? Whereby the me actually turns to face the I in the care of another perspective, when that perspective is capable of knowing you as the tension of those two at one time, right?
Beautiful.
There's a big difference between seeing someone's me as an object in the world and seeing the object silhouetted against a backdrop that indicates that that me has been subtracted from something that's of a higher order than itself. And one of the things that happens when you acquaint dialogically, I would say, and this happens, I think, this is what Philia Sophia, I think, is really about, is understanding the me of an individual as a subtraction from the I of their possibility. And when that happens, there's something far more like I, thou going on, whereby you're able to turn and face your I by with the surrogate I of the individual opposite you.
That's beautiful, Chris. That's totally true. Excellent.
Can I ask one more time really quickly on that? So your thoughts and your emotions, now that is I or that is me? Or is that irrelevant?
I didn't quite get the question.
Yeah, there was some sound problem there for just a second.
Okay, so like the I or the me, which one of those experiences emotion? Which one of those has thoughts? The I is having the thought, or the I is generating the thoughts, or is it the me?
But see, that's the I want to challenge the question.
Yeah.
I want to challenge the question as saying you should think of thinking and emoting as that which is transpiring between the I and the me, rather than as being located in the I or the me. So, I mean, and Chris alluded to this, we're making an argument that and Gregg has this in his model too, the self is inherently dialogical in nature. And that's why dialogos is the lifeblood of the self. That is why there's a deep ontological reason that grounds the necessity of our personhood in the dialogos.
Yeah, the other thing I would say is, right, that now we got to also back up and gain our understanding of, like, well, overarching concept of, like, well, what is mind and what is animal? When does a self emerge in relationship to this? I would certainly argue that, you know, emotion and primitive thought, at least, will precede a established conception of the self, if we think, again, phylogenetically. So really the self, if we go back and trace some of the things, the self is a cognitive modeling function, if we think about it evolutionary, that emerges as the mental behavioral processes get increasingly dynamically extended across time. Okay, so then that thing gets anchored as a center point of controlling the behavioral investment structure, but it emerges later than, say, an emotional fear response. We could see animals will have an emotional fear response before they would have any well-developed structural sense that we could then say, oh, that's a definite self that would have an I-me correspondent relation. So it's a complicated relation that I think that you're asking that could come at, to disentangle it would need to come at a number of different angles.
Awesome. Yeah. So much good stuff there. We're probably not going to get to all the questions, and we're not going to get into them in order, but we'll get to a lot of them. And Nick, Benjamin, if you can ask your question.
Hi, everybody. I've been reading Sri Nisargadatta Maharaj and Sri Ramana Maharshi on their Vedantic techniques and methods to uncover the source of the self and to elicit that understanding in the seeker at a participatory level. And it's my understanding that the I's and me's that you were talking about are relational and therefore relative and therefore not absolute and therefore not grounded in absolute truth. So I'm wondering, what are the differences between your framework or definition or theory regarding this self and the Vedantic traditional knowledge regarding the self?
Well, first of all, so there's an ontological difference. Well, I want to say that the model, I want to be really careful, because the model that we're working, I mean, we had a long, like we did 2 episodes around the self, no self debate. And believe it or not, that's a very vibrant debate within, you know, very tough-nosed cognitive science and neuroscience. I guess for me, where I'd hesitate is the couple of moves you made at the end there about if it's relational, it's relative, and therefore relative and not absolute. That was kind of an ontological point that we got into discussion about, because part of what's being proposed, and this is, you know, sort of counteracting the nominalism that goes back to the Enlightenment in European history. What's proposed in dynamical systems theory is no, relations are real. In fact, there's growing movement around the idea that relations are real. And part of why I wanted to bring that out is what we argued is the self is real as a dynamical system, but it's not real as a sort of single homogeneous entity. But then what I would say to that is, we don't think of anything very much being real as a single homogeneous entity anymore. I certainly don't think of this couch as real in that way. It's made up of a dynamical system of molecules. I don't think of that table over there as real. So we don't really have that notion of realness for most of the world anymore from a scientific perspective. So trying to hold the self hostage to a standard of realness that we don't apply in our worldview, I think is unfair. Now, this is not me trying to arrogantly overthrow 2 millennia of Vedanta thought. What I'm trying to say is, I think there are alternative ways of theorizing about the participatory experience that don't necessarily require those specific ontological moves. So what I'm suggesting to you is that there, you know, we can split the difference. I'm trying to ask you, can we split the difference between, you know, the agreeing on the phenomena and saying that perhaps there is now more appropriate language for talking about realness and intention in and intelligibility that is nevertheless comportable with a scientific worldview, but is, responsive and responsible to the phenomenological and transformative experience that Vedanta provides a framework for achieving. That's what I would say.
So I guess in response, I see the proof as the proof of the success of the theory of the self as being in whether or not at the end of the day, in its application, it causes the cessation of suffering completely. And of course, this is again from a classical Buddhist background. This my own path that I'm
Sure.
sharing with you here.
Sure.
Yeah. The cessation of a question.
I think he might come back, but any thoughts from the three of you?
There's also there's again an implicit presupposition there that there has been an absolute final method for the cessation of suffering, which I would want to call into question. I think that our capacity to intervene and ameliorate suffering can learn a lot from historical traditions. But I mean, Gregg knows this from all the advances that go on in clinical therapy. Our ability to deal with suffering is much more specific and precise and comprehensive and systematic. I would want a model of the self that tells me how to help somebody who's struggling from depression or anxiety on one end, and also that helps help somebody who's suffering from existential despair, the way Siddhartha Gautama. And I would propose that it's not just a sort of blanket the ability to address suffering, but a comprehensive and complexified ability to address suffering that we should use as our standard of evaluation.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo John's point at the level of, I do think, there's languages of explaining and languages of training. We got into some of that conversation in relation. You could absolutely develop ways of being in the world and ways of cultivating that were led to certain kinds of enlightenment, but wouldn't necessarily fit meeting epistemological criteria, say that modern science would say this affords you experimental data, affords you eliminating alternative explanations, affords you abduction in terms of just description and explaining from a naturalistic perspective. Of course, that requires all sorts of commitments. Here's what I would say in terms of my own frame of reference from somebody who's trying to bridge between a comprehensive meta theory of human psychology on the one hand that is grounded in modern natural science and cognitive science, and a coherent picture of psychotherapy. The consolidation of the psychotherapy picture that I offer is an integrated approach to psychological mindfulness. And that psychological mindfulness cultivates awareness, acceptance, and orientation toward valued states of being. A lot of that has to do with becoming aware of and letting go of sort of the ego's, reciprocal narrowing frame of trying to control one's feelings, grab desires, acquire various things, compare oneself to the other, and maintain particular kinds of control and resistance to pain. Well, that at least in both the Buddhist and Hindu traditions afford very similar kinds of models toward this inner science of the subjective well-being that I think is very much aligned. So there's a lot of backdrop. You get into ontological claims at a backdrop level, but I would argue that the science of well-being from both East and West, certainly at least the integrated model that I hang out with, has enormous congruence with what is said from the Buddhist and Hindu traditions in relationship to the alleviation of suffering.
Chris, any
Nothing to add. Thank you, though.
Evan, I know you have to bounce and you had a question.
Thanks. Yeah. So I'm loving the conversation so far, and I haven't unfortunately gotten a chance to watch the entire series, which I definitely intend to. So maybe you covered this, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the sort of tension between describing things like self and I and ego as essentially objects or nouns, right? Versus as essentially verbs or processes. So, if you think towards the second option of looking at things like Whitehead's process metaphysics, right? Where actual entities are those that are expressed in terms of changes over time in relationships rather than any specifically locatable collection of stuff, so to speak, right? And it sounds like, at least in this discussion so far, I'm having a hard time really figuring out whether these words like self and I and me are referring in essence to like process or to thing, right? And so I'd like to hear some clarification about the ways you guys ended up approaching this sort of dichotomy and analysis.
So it's a great question, Evan. And so Greg and I are diving deeply into Whitehead right now. But I would say that if I'll answer the question and then I'll undermine my own answer, which is if I had to choose, what we were clearly arguing for was the self as a verb rather than the self as a noun. The idea, and in fact, we were trying to make a case for shifting the prioritization of ontological reality off of Aristotelian nouns onto something like dynamical system processes. That was very, and as I was in my previous answer, I was trying to indicate, we have already done that implicitly as a culture, but we just really won't acknowledge it to ourselves. And then when we turn to talk about the self, we abandon all of the ways in which we've shifted our notion of reality from nouns to verbs, and then we go back to nouns. And we felt that that was an unfair move to make. So on balance, I would say it's definitely much more Whiteheadian than Aristotelian. On the other hand, given what I just said, part of what we were trying to do is to get the thing with and I think this is something that needs to be more explicated and elucidated from Whitehead. And it came out in some of the discussions I had with Bernardo Kastrup and with Matt Segal, right? Is when you look, the problem with thinking about process is people think about it like this, right? And you have to think about process as, and I think Whitehead does this. He obviously he has this, the horizontal line time, but he also has the emergence emanation. And trying to get a way of and the problem when people hear process is they still hear just this. And so that's right. I'm answering your question, but I want to really sort of really put as much Whiteheadian salt on it as possible, because right, getting the what you might call the vertical dimension of the self, with the emergence and the emanation relation, and putting that into the language of dynamical systems theory and relevance realization, and then into Gregg's phylogenetic framework, which is also has to do with the vertical ontology. That was a key move made. So my answer is it's more verb than noun, but when you hear verb, you have to hear the eternal ontology and not just the temporal unfolding.
Yeah, I really look forward to just diving into Whitehead. My feeling about Whitehead is that he makes a brilliant and crucial move going process. My general position as a meta theorist is adopt the weak version of everybody's frame, okay? And that is, I think he moves a little too hard against structure at times, and in trying to, meaning that, but the bottom line is that the structure I'm operating off of is depicted by the tree of knowledge, at least that my natural scientific ontology. It both then gives me a descriptive metaphysics, it gives me a cosmic evolutionary view, and that's an unfolding wave of causality. That's fundamentally, it sits on an energy information field that is very, very dynamic, and it's constantly moving in a processorial way through time across various different dimensions. And so really, it is much better to be thinking about these concepts, as change processes over time, which we extract patterns out. And then we'll circle them and say, well, our intuition, when we pull that into high relief and say, well, that's the thing we're talking about, well, then that's going to have a nounal aspect. I'll really also make a nod here to Bruce Alderman, who developed an integral grammatology, which I find to be very powerful. It's an integrated metaphysics that applies the way our propositional grammars work across adjectives, adverbs, nouns, and in particular prepositions in relational space. And that affords a really interesting angle to see the way in which we construe relation. across a wide variety of different domains. And he argues that, hey, we should be able to bounce between these various prepositional paths to see an integrated whole. And I'm in big agreement there. So I really do like Whitehead. I think we are operating from a verb, verb and process orientation. But it's also the case that I think we can stop and frame these as nouns with some degree of coherence as well.
Yeah, I think the word, like the idea of a dynamical system, is it tries to transcend that dichotomy because it tries to integrate real structure, real relations with real process. And so that I'm just sort of trying to amplify what Gregg just said.
The other thing I have to say is -1 + 1 or -x + x actually is embedded in the architecture of the system. That's a totally different crazy narrative. But maybe, Evan, you and I will hook up one day and I'll at least give you my take on that algorithm and how it actually weaves through an enormous number of different pieces from a mathematical, formal, algorithmic kind of perspective.
I don't have much to add to that, except to say that the capacity of the definition to traverse both the noun and the verb, let's say dimensions of speech, is pretty compatible, I would say, with a more Heideggerian idea that self, by definition, is a condition of being in the world, and both can serve to describe the state of that condition and also describe the directions of its action and thinking, right, in a more normative sense. So insofar as we could alternate between those two axes, we could probably step back and enfold them within a broader scope altogether, and probably can continue to do that in continuity, actually.
Any follow-up, Evan?
Yeah, quick follow-up. If you so I guess what's coming to mind now, I loved all the responses, is so the thought that our way of languaging this stuff has clearly been influenced by the results of mathematical science over the course of the past few hundred years. And I'm wondering if there's a similar contribution to be made from computational science. And I don't mean specifically computational models of the brain or anything, though those are cool. But what I mean is the concept of a pointer, right? So an indexical. And of course, in computer science, you can have a pointer to a function or to an object type variable. And sometimes you can sort of equivocate and do clever things with using a single pointer as both a function and an object, for example. So I wonder if there might be some fruitful efforts, if you guys think there might be some fruitful efforts in that direction to sort of take some of the modes of thinking and ways of relating from, say, specifically like functional programming metaphors in trying to construct a better sort of philosophical meta language for describing self.
Yeah, that's great, Evan. And we did do that. There's a part in where we talk about the demonstrative indexicality of the self, trying to pick up on that specifically, and then integrating that also with something that's come out of the machine learning AI, which is a recursive relevance realization, and showing how you can actually integrate that and explain some pretty robust empirical findings around multiple object tracking and things like that. So we actually do that. I mean, I don't mean exhaustively or completely, but we follow up on that inspiration explicitly.
Right. Alex Ebert, you had a question? You can unmute yourself.
Oh, hey guys. Gregg, you kind of answered it, or well, you told me to holler at you in a bit about it regarding -x plus x equals 0. So my question was, maybe you can touch on it, because I'm thinking a lot about lack and self. What role does lack play in becoming? It seems to play an integral role. And is the, let's see, how did I phrase it? Oh, whatever, doesn't matter. You see it there. Any more to say on that would be helpful, because 0, after all, is an equilibrium point, sort of a 0 point from which we can then oscillate and create newness. And so, yeah, to what extent is 0 sort of optimal for the next transcendence?
Yeah, for me, that's a multi-layered question that would need lots of different reference points. But I'll make a couple of points in relationship to it. And actually, I saw the negative X and saw Evan and blah, 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 but I'm glad you're brought in here, Alex. Good to see you. So I had a couple of really powerful conversations with Cadell last and have appreciated his psychoanalytic angle in relationship to the consciousness and the self. He does a nice deep dive into the dark pathic manner of being in relation. And I think that there is certainly something to be said for the positive structure of the self as in its acquisition, in its mode of engagement, in its operation, and to always be then thinking about, I've really found myself, I should owe Roy Bhaskar, it got me thinking along this time. Anytime, and I actually, the stuff that I did with the justification got me thinking, the positive space that's taken up, okay, pulls away from other possibilities, meaning that it's often driven in relationship to acquire is to do what in relationship to what. And very often the drives that people have are to fill a hidden absence. And this is a fundamental perspective in relationship to the psychoanalytic vantage point. And for me, I think that there's an enormous amount of play to be given. And this is, I started talking with Cadell about this, with some of Jacques Lacan's notions about the real and the imagined and these kinds of elements. Now, that's another area in which I am very teased by a lot of possibilities with the system that I developed, but unfortunately am not refined enough to speak with a lot of depth around. But I will say this, the positivity of the consciousness system that we attend to, it has to be taken into consideration the shadow features of that, and given the Jungian elements and the ideas about what it is that would drive that and where that would come from the void, so to speak, and a holistic picture of what is positive relative to negative space. Or I shall say this, a holistic picture requires a dialectical appreciation for the positive affirmation relative to the negative space. And that's where I hear you in that question across a number of different layers. And I think it's a very, very powerful frame.
Thank you.
Chris or John?
I would just say, I don't think I have too much to add to that, except that to take a completely different view of the question than Gregg just took. I mean, the realization of lack is precisely the impetus for the Socratic eros that sets us off on, that initiates the project, right? That lack is far from being a kind of an incidental feature of the self as we encounter it in its more positive constructs. I would say the lack is, at least from a more kind of embodied existential perspective, is where we begin. It's where the awe for the term begins, is the realization that whatever we are does in fact lack its, let's say, the whole of its definition. And so to me, the precise revelation that incites the Socratic eros that has us turn in the direction of the question is precisely the revelation of lack as a kind of, as the place where our presumed egoic knowledge bottoms out and the self begins properly.
I think that was great. I think that notion of lack and its, the connection to the Socratic eros points to something that we strove very much to do in the model, which is to build a model of the self in which self-transcendence is an integral part. And their self-transcendence makes no sense without there being a lack. And when you try, and if you're going to make self-transcendence an integral part of the self, you have to hit the paradox of self-transcendence, which is, I mean, and Strawson made this famous. Agnes Callard talks about L.A. Paul, right? If I make it, if I make the future self, it's just an extension of my current self, because it's not radically other than me, because I made it. And if something other than me makes it, although it transcends me, it's not self-transcendence because it's not me anymore. How do you get self-creation? How do you get self-training? What kind of identity indifference which is what you're presupposing in self-transcendence, can we actually talk about, and how can we integrate that into and make it a central feature of the self? That was something we wrestled with significantly. So I mean, Chris was already making it deep with the notion of Socratic eros, but I'm trying to sort of, you know, into the warp and woof of the self is this eros, the Socratic eros, because the degree to which it is aspires to rationality, it aspires to self-correction, and insofar as it's aspiring to self-correction, it requires self-transcendence, and then that gets us into the core of the question that we're talking about here right now, which is, how do we get a model of the self that can make sense of this capacity?
And I'll just say what we hit just at the very end, you know, the session 12, which maybe people haven't seen, but all of a sudden we got entangled with self, soul, and spirit. And to me, the intersection here, this is, you know, and the capacity to build systems that go from cognitive science to clinical science to existential, and then speak to a language that affords us this capacity. I think this issue of lacks and transcendence and is all entangled also with us you know, encountering these terms of self, soul, and spirit, and reintegrating them, I think, in a coherent way, or at least reintroducing them to many people, at least certainly in John and my circles in the science world.
Any follow-up, Alex?
No, that's excellent. I guess just pointing to, you know, I'm a musician, so I look at waveforms all the time, and the 0 point, which is supposedly silence, which is of course never silent actually, is the equilibrium for the next transcendent waveform. And if negative x plus x always equals 0, so negative I plus I, and then I get to 0, I get to that 0 point, that equilibrium, from which then I embark on, you know, my new space. But importantly, that 0 point is a sort of, well, it's equilibrium. It's a sort of a death of sorts, and it's a sort of enlightened state that is a non-becoming state. And then in order to move again, I need to acquire some kind of lack. So and get into process again. So I just find it apropos of this, and yeah, appreciate the conversation.
I'll make one more comment about this, just in terms of, because I see this now clinically in one of my doctoral students is doing a dissertation on the concept of borderline personality, looking through the unified theory to organize what fundamentally is the core of that pathology. If we just talk about the continuum of structure, here's what I'll offer, just kind of to play off the positive and negative X around 0 and equilibrium. What I'm seeing with a lot of frequency now, at least it's salient, and then what I'm aspectualizing, is the difference between healthy opponent process, whereby, say, a masculine and feminine energy intersect, or a competitive and cooperative dynamic, or a order and chaos inside the multiplicity of selves, whereby the parts respect the dialectical difference and honor in positive opposition that space. In other words, the negative appreciates the positive and finds equilibrium sanity in as it hits the balance. The borderline state is exactly the opposite. It's fraught with negative and positive, but these are destructive, vicious opposites in relation as they are experienced. In other words, the hatred of the other is just rageful, and then the abandonment in relationship to that hates the fact that you hate it and feels regret and shame. The system itself, both inside vertically and horizontally, is then fraught with the vicious cycles of opponent process that are destructive and vacillating in relationship to a similar polarity, but one that's fundamentally degrading as opposed to synergistically and coherently integrating.
All right. We might be able to sneak in 2 more questions. Robert Gray, you had a question. I believe you can read it now.
Yeah, thank you. There's a hurricane outside, I think, or some severe weather. So if there's debris that flies at me, I apologize. So I was wondering.
Robert. Good to see you, Robert.
It's great to see you as well, sir. I was wondering how your model of the self notices, understands, and applies virtues such as agape, hope, or faith, or any of the four cardinal virtues, and how those would fit into this thing that you're talking about, this process you're talking about.
So I mean, that's a long thing to say, but the model of the self is ultimately built off the machinery of relevance realization, and that actually integrates with this body of emerging research on self-relevance. Relevance to an autopoietic agent is what actually glues the psyche together. It's called the glue of cognition and perception and memory. And this just fits very well with relevance realization to an autopoietic system, a self-making system, a system that has to care about information because it's always taking care of itself. And as soon as we do that, we see that there is a deep connection between taking care of the self and caring about information. And then if we realize that, and this is where Gregg's model helps, because we move into a cultural space, we also have an inversion of that, which is not just how things matter or are important, like even literally eating. To me, we also invert that into how do I matter? How am I relevant to others? So soon as the machinery of proto-self and agency is taken into the cultural sphere, and Gregg makes the, which was like a really insightful bridging. You know, the mammalian parenting and attachment system is what starts that flip, because parents have to do that flip. It's not how does the child matter to them, but how do they matter to the child? And so when you get that inversion and then you take it up into cultural space, what you've done is you've said that relevance realization that was egocentric, right, now has to become other-centric, allocentric, and ultimately ontocentric, because if I'm caring and about how I matter to others, that of course is agape. And if I want to do it in a way that is fair and just, I'm bringing in justice. And if I want to do it in a way that has minimized self-deception and enhanced connectedness as much as possible, then I want to, then I'm talking about wisdom. So what I'm actually saying, Robert, is that because the model is based on relevance realization to an autopoietic adaptive agent that then gets transformed in mammalian parental relationships, and then gets taken up another ratch when you go into, you know, the cultural justification sphere that Gregg has done so much work on, then it's very clear how as the self moves up that ontological phylogenetic axis, it is going to become more and more invested and involved, I'm using one of Gregg's terms, in virtuous behavior. And now what you think of virtue as precisely sets of constraints, a virtual engine on a dynamically self-organizing entity. And that's what the self is. It is a dynamically self-organizing process that is complexifying both across time and across ontological levels. It's going to inherently be involved with virtue.
This is to me, it's a great question. It's a fascinating question, because immediately you then bring in the whole fact value kind of dynamic, which I believe is a lot more complicated than is often appreciated. I do believe, though, that the epistemology of science is about developing accurate models to describe and explain change. So it is very difficult to derive what ought to be from, say, a scientific epistemology alone. However, science then should be interacting, and there are bridging points. I have a friend who I would recommend if you're interested in Aristotle, Blaine Fowers, who has argued for the analysis of our virtue from an Aristotelian perspective, and emphasizing sort of the connection between function and form, and the way in which function and form can be corresponded. So for example, what makes a good knife? Sharpness, and that it becomes a good knife. Well, he applies that and then thinks about it. Well, what makes a good person? Well, it's complicated. Okay, so we want lots of qualifications, but at the same time, if we are articulating models of the self and its functional form in particular ways, I think we can absolutely specify various aspects of which would be a fulfilling optimal functioning form, i.e. systems that cohere together, that foster recursive relevance realization, that enable virtuous ways of being across wide variety of different domains. It doesn't take much sort of extreme subjective valuation to say, hey, there's an optimal trajectory in relationship to that versus a disintegrating, decohering, suffering, and destructive set of cycles, okay, that fragment and break in relation. And you can actually employ, I think, a lot of foundational evolutionary functional analysis. That's a fascinating thing for me as a clinical psychologist in psychiatry. The last thing I'll say about this is there is no good way of doing this in clinical psychology and psychiatry. What do I mean by that? The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual from Psychiatry is a collection of symptoms, okay? And what basically all the diagnoses are is they say, hey, you have these negative symptoms that are associated with distress and dysfunction. Reference to what? The absence of them, okay? I have a friend, a pathologist professor, who's really interested in psychiatry. And he was like, you know, the first thing I learned to understand the pathology of the liver and the kidneys was what? What an optimal liver and kidney looks like. Okay, there is no reference point for what an optimal human looks like. And this is a very complicated question. Trust me, there are lots of reasons for us to be hesitant, and put that in medicalized language is dangerous. But at the same time, it's an absolutely central question. The job of a psychotherapist, if you come to me and I'm a psychotherapist, I have to have a notion about where you are, where you might be in a more fulfilled, optimal functioning sort of way. And that's inherent to the task. So this issue about this, what is the model of the self and what affords virtue that we're striving for, and what kind of functional forms would orient toward that virtue, and what kind of functional forms would trap you in maladaptive cycles that deviate that, is absolutely central to the, I would argue, to the enterprise of, say, psychotherapy and what we're doing when we're cultivating, say, psychological well-being.
I'm just going to compliment that. Well, compliment it first, and then complement it by saying that so I would refer everyone, just if you haven't seen the last session, John brought in an example from Iris Murdoch and Wright, who does some secondary work on that, which is the idea of sensibility transcendence. And the example from Murdoch, I won't go into it again because you already do it, John, but it has to do with a person being viewed within the boundaries of very well-defined categories, right? Categories that outline a person's temperament or traits or particular capacities according to established dimensions in the world that are replicable and reproducible. And so one way of understanding, especially where philia meets agape, where the encounter with another individual precipitates a kind of dynamic transcendence that reorganizes the categorical way we understand ourselves and understand the world writ large, has to do with the breaking of the frame that is constituted by that kind of categorical thinking in the face of an encounter that becomes aphoretic, when an individual, let's say, refuses to conform to the categories that we foist upon them, either because we've come equipped with them based on prior experience, or because they're part of an established cultural precedent, right? So John, using Murdoch, describes this encounter whereby the mother-in-law looks at the daughter-in-law and, having found her irritable and, altogether agitating, realizes that all of those traits that she had categorized under the banner of that temperament really actually referred to a different temperament altogether, didn't refer to the categories that were known and familiar, but actually referred to categories that in their particular combination had been unseen and unknown entirely, right? Augustine, I think, has a pretty important insight, which is that one cannot know thyself without being known, when the order of being known exceeds the order of knowing that you've brought to bear on yourself at the first instance, right? Or he also says that the soul must be enlightened by a light outside of itself. And really what that means is, I think, that in order for the model that John and Gregg have described to remain dynamic and to remain mutable, not infinitely mutable, obviously, not so much that it disperses and can't properly recollect itself and resolve itself, but mutable insofar as it maintains a tension of continuity while also being able to self-transcend. It requires the intervention of a listener or an external knower that becomes a criterion by which we can know ourselves differently than we have ever been able to know ourselves before. And the minute that frame is capable of being broken by the intervention of that supervenient listener, we actually become capable of renewing the concept of ourselves that becomes the premise upon which all of our ego is maintained, and our persona, for that matter, too, to kind of play into the Jungian typology a little bit more, right? Martin Buber says something very similar, which is that that spirit, so defined, is the individual's response to his you, right? The part of him that, again, turns to face himself in the carriage of the external listener, if that listener is attentive enough to be able to see all of those things that are otherwise absent from the model in its current form, right? So in any case, just to sort of cite an example a little bit lower on the ground of experience, I would recommend a second look at that case study, for lack of a better word, because I think it's deeply, deeply illustrative of that insight, which again, comes down from, in many ways, from the Platonists, but via Augustine and so forth.
Any quick follow-up, Robert?
Yeah, I was wondering, would active imagination or deity worship be similar to the same kind of sensibility transcendence of the self-other encounter in therapy, or maybe what you were talking about in what you said?
I think active imagination, definitely. I think one of the functions of active imagination, in fact, is to artfully undermine the categorical structure of the presentation of the world. That's one of the things that it actually affords, the kind of spontaneous generation of active imagination. It's not without constraint, and it can't be, right? And I think in order to function, but I think precisely what it's trying to do is change the mode of inquiry that frames our encounter with the world, such that it actually emerges, the coloration of the world actually changes. It emerges, and the formal presentation of the world actually changes its hue. And therefore, that allows us to transcend some of the categories that we bring to bear upon it that would otherwise constrain the number of possibilities it could present to us at any given moment. So I can't remember what the other example you gave was. Active imagination was one, and
Deity worship.
Deity worship. Yeah. Well, I guess that phrase could be taken in a number of different ways. I'll just say, yes, I do think, at least by some definition of the term, I think that fits.
Yeah, I would just say that it's especially, I drop in my clinical hat on here, the ability to shift perspectives, to get outside of one's often self-absorbed, reciprocally narrowing perspective, and shift either just to a third-person perspective, or ideally at times the perspective of a sage, the capacity to mentalize. If you look at Fonagy's mentalization therapy, the capacity to expand the awareness of the other, to empathize with the other. Indeed, in fact, if you look at sort of a continuity of psychological functioning across self and other, this capacity to step outside oneself and to empathize with complexity, accuracy, compassion, to see oneself through the eyes of others in relationship to that, creates flexibility, creates capacity for communication, creates flexible problem solving in a wide variety of different domains. So I think to cultivate virtue, the ability to step outside of one's egoic, sort of self-absorbed narrative of being and shift that framing is essential to flexible, adaptive, productive, virtuous thinking.
Yeah, I would follow up with that. That clinical work is deeply convergent with a lot of emerging work in cognitive psychology, cognitive science. Baltes and Staudiger's work on wisdom, Igor Grossman's The Solomon Effect, and the wisdom consensus paper that myself and Igor Grossman and a bunch of other theorists, researchers, we published in 2019, that the core of wisdom is this meta-perspectival ability. And so, active imagination, insofar as it is an imaginal enactment of meta-perspectival abilities, should afford wisdom. I mean, it's absolutely the case that it should. And because it's imaginal, it should afford a kind of insight that's bridges between the conceptual and the experiential in a powerful way, and therefore is also integrative, affording deep understanding. And I think the way that new therapies like internal family systems therapy, it has rejuvenated, not just theoretically, but I think practically, active imagination. One of the problems with the traditional version of active imagination as given by Jung is it relied on mental imagery. And Jung was extremely gifted in mental imagery, and he overgeneralized. We now have very good data that the capacity for mental imagery varies considerably within the population, so much so that there's perhaps 5 to 10% of people who cannot form pictures in their mind. That's now we're moving towards consensus on that. So Jung presumed a homogeneity when there is not such a homogeneity. And so some of the newer therapies that are not so reliant on mental imagery, like the way IFS uses somatic and dialogical and writing, a whole bunch of other techniques to supplement it, I think has rejuvenated the capacity both to use active imagination, I'm now broadening the genus, and thereby also study its efficaciousness. I think that is going to mean more and more of the work on the therapeutic use of the imaginal, and more of the work on the cognitive science of wisdom are going to come into increasing integration with each other.
All right. Thank you, Robert, for your question. So we're at the bottom of the hour. Perhaps maybe just go around with you three, just any closing thoughts.
I'm just impressed again and again how brilliant Gregg and Chris are. Like, it's always like it's like in the inevitable egocentric narcissism of my own thought, I'll be thinking, oh, that was a really good answer I gave John, and then Gregg or Chris come out and they give this from a totally different thing, and oh my, I would never have thought of that, and that humbling is so deeply appreciated, and it's reflected in this is what I love about Dialogos, the fact that we can get to a place together that we can't get to on our own. So just that's my parting thought.
Amen, John. And obviously, of course, the feeling is completely mutual, friend. You know that, and you're an academic hero of mine. To me, what is beginning to really get woven, and both at the level of sort of the structure and function, but the process too, the nod to the white head and with dialectic and those kinds of elements. I'm really, I don't know, I feel kind of giddy about the whole Dialogos thing. I really love the process. And of course, here at the Stoa, which Peter, you've done an unbelievable job stewarding these kinds of elements. I'm feeling the opportunity for, post-Socratic revival of a particular kind of dialogue. And John, of course, your leadership and vision on that's been unbelievable. And Chris, the fluidity and magical prose that comes out every time you begin, I'm just on the edge of my seat going, oh my God, where did he find that word in sequence? It's like fucking music. So it's been a hell of an honor, and myself has been deeply enriched and humbled, and I really appreciated the journey.
Well, like I said, Gregg, John, the honor was mine, and I retain it. It was, it's mutual. It's mutual, gentlemen. You know the respect, the abundant respect I have for both of you, and love for that matter. And I'm not over the novelty yet of the fact that we have these conversations and folks find them interesting. I'm still just kind of humbled by that. I'm not even over that novelty yet. I don't even know if I'm going to get over that novelty anytime soon. That in and of itself, I can't can't manage to take that.
I do want to say that again. I'm sorry to cut you off, Chris, but I don't know how many people have gone to conferences or looked at journals and watched the debate in a journal. I lived my whole life on that. Okay. I grew up all in academia. The difference in structure, what you're trying to do to defend a written position and reply in relation. If you look at like brain and behavioral sciences or anything, it's such a fundamentally different activity that we have going here. And like you can cut somebody off and engage in it. No, I'm sorry. But I just needed to say that there really is a fun, and I do hope that we are on the cusp of really actually sparking it. I'm sorry, I had to just reiterate that, Chris.
No, you're right, Greg. It's funny, like this exercise, rich as it always is, it always feels incredibly precarious, and it always feels dangerous. It always feels like walking a tightrope over the edge of an abyss. And I think that it needs to feel that way in order for it to have the efficacy that it has. So to me, that's becomes an implicit feature of the experience, and one that I've come to value. But I can't underscore the prominence of that feature. I never take for granted the fact that we come to the table and something good comes of it. I never take that for granted for a second. And a lot of it has to do with the awareness of being witnessed in the act. And being witnessed in the act does something. It does something that, I love the privacy of, I love these conversations in the private sphere too, for their own reasons. But there is something about the public nature of this that is inimitable, truly. And I know we've tried to get to the bottom of that, but there's a great deal more bottom to get to. So, the end of this is elliptical. It should be. And it gestures to the necessity of more. So thank you, everyone. And Peter, this was great to come on the Stoa, just to see you.
Amen, Peter.
Yes, thanks, Peter. Thank you very much, my friend.
Awesome. Thank you, my friends. Always a gift having you three visit the Stoa. I see you as pioneers in the era of dialogos, which is upon us. And I'm excited for where these conversations take us all. So yeah, the next session at the Stoa, we're finished for events for the week, but we got a big one on Monday. Noam Chomsky is coming back. I had a conversation with Natalie Wynn, ContraPoints, 6 p.m. Eastern time. You can check out other events at thestoa.ca. So John, Gregg, Chris, and everyone, thank you so much for coming to Stoa today.
Thank you, friend.
Thank you.